He looked straight at her and said with a calm smile that felt almost surgical, "You don't actually hate corporate money. You just hate admitting where yours comes from." The room froze, not because of volume or anger, but because everyone instantly understood that this was not a line meant to win applause. It was meant to open a file. If you are already wondering why that sentence mattered, why it felt heavier than 100 shouting matches on cable news, stay with me until the end of this video. Because what followed was not a viral clash designed for social media, but a collision between two completely different philosophies of power. And once you see that collision clearly, it becomes impossible to unsee how modern American politics really works. Now let me be transparent with you from the very beginning, because pretending neutrality here would be dishonest and frankly insulting to your intelligence. I do not approach this confrontation as a fan of either politician, nor as a reflexive defender of one ideology over another, but as someone who studies political incentives for a living. What interests me is not who sounds more righteous, but who understands the rules of the system they claim to want to change. And in that moment, when Ted Cruz delivered that line, something deeper than a partisan insult was happening in real time. It was a test of whether performance could survive contact with process. This story does not begin in that hearing room, even though that is where most people first noticed something was off. It begins years earlier, with the rise of a political figure who mastered the language of moral urgency better than almost anyone of her generation. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez did not simply enter Congress, she arrived as a symbol, carrying with her the hopes, frustrations, and aspirations of a movement that felt locked out of power. She spoke in complete sentences that felt emotionally complete, sentences that required no footnotes, no spreadsheets, and no uncomfortable trade-off discussions. And for a long time, that was not just effective, it was unstoppable. Ted Cruz, by contrast, was never built to inspire affection, and he likely understands that better than anyone in Washington. He is a lawyer by instinct and by temperament, a man whose comfort zone is not applause, but cross-examination. Where others seek moments, he seeks leverage, and where others chase headlines, he collects documentation. That difference matters more than personality, because it shapes how each of them approaches conflict. One performs conflict as persuasion, the other treats conflict as an audit. When these two figures inevitably collided, the outcome was never going to hinge on who spoke more passionately or who had more followers online. It was going to hinge on which style of power holds up when the cameras keep rolling past the applause. This is where my own view becomes unavoidable, because I believe American politics has entered a dangerous phase of emotional inflation. We reward intensity more than accuracy, certainty more than competence, and outrage more than preparation. And that imbalance creates an opening for moments like the one you are about to see unpacked. On the surface, the setting looked boring, even forgettable, the kind of oversight hearing that normally exists only as background noise for policy staffers. Infrastructure, budgets, long-term spending frameworks, none of it designed to trend or circulate outside procedural circles. But political instincts do not turn off just because the topic is dry, especially for someone who understands how attention converts into power. AOC arrived knowing exactly how these moments can be reframed, repackaged, and redeployed to reinforce an existing narrative. She did what she had done successfully many times before, shifting the focus from policy to character. From a media standpoint, the move made sense because personal framing travels faster than structural discussion. Audiences understand stories of hypocrisy more easily than they understand line items and funding mechanisms. And accusing an opponent of abandoning constituents fits neatly into a pre-existing storyline many people already believed. This was not improvisation. It was a continuation of a tested strategy that had delivered results for years. The problem was not the attack itself, but the assumption that the response would be defensive. Ted Cruz did not respond the way these moments are usually designed to be responded to. He did not interrupt. He did not raise his voice, and he did not try to reclaim moral ground with counter-rhetoric. Instead, he waited, because waiting is often the most destabilizing move in a performance-based confrontation. When he finally spoke, he spoke like someone who had prepared for this exact scenario long before it happened. That preparation changed the geometry of the exchange instantly. Here is where the deeper lesson begins to emerge, and it is uncomfortable for both sides of the political spectrum. Modern political communication trains audiences to expect emotional escalation, not evidentiary escalation. We are conditioned to measure strength by volume and sincerity by intensity. But Cruz chose to measure strength by documentation and sincerity by consistency across time. That choice forced the audience to switch mental gears mid-conversation. You could almost feel the room recalibrating in real time, because this was no longer about winning a moment. It was about who had actually done their homework and who had assumed the script would protect them. This is where I want to pause and ask you a question that might make some people uncomfortable. If you believe in transparency and accountability, do you believe those standards should apply equally to the politicians you admire, or only to the ones you already distrust? The reason that question matters is because AOC's public identity is built on a promise of moral clarity. She positions herself not just as a representative, but as a corrective force within a corrupt system. That promise carries power, but it also carries risk, because clarity invites scrutiny. Once scrutiny enters the conversation, symbolism alone is no longer enough to carry the argument. And that is the moment where many political brands start to crack. Ted Cruz understands this dynamic instinctively, because he has spent his career operating inside hostile rooms. He is rarely given the benefit of doubt, which means he prepares as if none will be offered. That preparation is not charisma, and it does not translate well into viral clips unless the context is fully preserved. But when it lands with weight, because it shifts the burden of proof. Suddenly, the question is no longer who sounds right, but who can back it up. As the exchange unfolded, it became clear that this was not really a debate about infrastructure or even about personal behavior. It was a referendum on two different theories of political legitimacy. One theory argues that moral alignment with the people justifies aggressive simplification of reality. The other argues that legitimacy comes from mastery of process, even when that mastery feels cold or uninspiring. Neither theory is inherently evil, but they are incompatible in moments of direct confrontation. There is a certain irony here that deserves to be acknowledged, because irony is often where truth hides in politics. Progressive movements often argue that institutions are broken and must be challenged from the outside. Yet, the moment those institutions push back using their own rules, outrage follows. Cruz did not invent new standards in that room. He applied existing ones with precision. That precision is what made the moment uncomfortable rather than explosive. If you were expecting a shouting match, this moment felt almost anticlimactic. If you were expecting a viral takedown, what you got instead was something closer to a deposition. That difference matters, because depositions change outcomes long after the headlines fade. They create records, and records outlive moments. This is why that initial sentence, delivered so quietly, carried so much force. As we move forward in this story, you will see how this single exchange began to ripple outward. You will see how media narratives adjusted, how allies recalculated, and how critics sharpened their questions. You will also see how neither figure walked away untouched, despite the asymmetry of the moment. Because accountability cuts both ways once it enters the room. And once it does, there is no clean exit for anyone involved. In the next section, we are going to examine how Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez built the political machine that made this confrontation possible in the first place. We will look at the strengths of that machine, the vulnerabilities embedded within it, and the assumptions that went unchallenged for too long. This is not about tearing down a movement, but about understanding why movements sometimes struggle when symbolism meets scrutiny. If you want to understand why this moment felt different, you need to understand what came before it. And that is exactly where we are going next. To understand why that confrontation landed with such force, you have to understand the machinery that carried Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez into national relevance so quickly and so completely. She did not simply win an election. She disrupted an ecosystem that had grown comfortable with predictability and incremental change. Her rise felt spontaneous to outsiders, but it was the product of timing, narrative alignment, and a media environment hungry for moral clarity. At a moment when politics felt stale and transactional, she offered language that felt urgent, human, and morally decisive. That language became her greatest asset, and eventually, her most fragile one. AOC's political power does not primarily come from legislation, committee seniority, or institutional leverage, at least not in the traditional sense. It comes from her ability to frame issues as moral conflicts rather than procedural disputes. When she speaks, she rarely begins with policy mechanics. Instead, she begins with values, injustice, and lived experience. That approach bypasses technocratic resistance and connects directly with audiences who feel excluded from political complexity. It is an extraordinarily effective strategy in a media landscape that rewards emotional coherence over operational detail. Social media amplified this advantage in ways that few politicians fully understood at the time. Platforms designed for brevity and virality naturally favor messages that are emotionally legible without context. AOC mastered this environment not by accident, but by intuition and discipline. She understood that clarity beats nuance online, and that outrage travels faster than explanation. Every post, every clip, every line was optimized not for committees, but for consciousness. This is where many critics misunderstand her appeal and therefore underestimate her intelligence. She is not naive about the system. She is strategic about how she interacts with it. She knows that legislative wins take years, while narrative wins can be secured in minutes. In a polarized environment, shaping the narrative often matters more than shaping the bill. Her critics often call this performative, but performance is not the opposite of power. It is one of its oldest tools. The problem arises when performance becomes a substitute for process rather than a gateway into it. For a long time, AOC was insulated from that problem by the sheer novelty of her presence. She represented youth, diversity, and disruption in a Congress that visibly lacked all three. Media outlets treated her not just as a lawmaker, but as a cultural figure whose statements were inherently newsworthy. That attention created a protective halo that softened scrutiny and reframed criticism as hostility. Within progressive circles, this dynamic intensified even further. Criticism of her positions was often interpreted as an attack on the movement she symbolized. That made internal correction difficult, because disagreement was framed as betrayal. Over time, the movement began to conflate moral alignment with strategic competence. This is a common pattern in activist-driven politics, and it rarely ends well. As her influence grew, expectations shifted, even if quietly. Supporters wanted her to remain uncompromising, but institutions demanded negotiation. She was expected to be both an insurgent and a legislator simultaneously. Those roles require different skill sets, and the tension between them is not easily resolved. Ignoring that tension does not make it disappear. It only delays the reckoning. One of the most revealing aspects of AOC's political style is her relationship with detail. She speaks fluently about goals, outcomes, and injustices, but often resists narrowing into implementation specifics. This is not because she lacks intelligence, but because specificity introduces trade-offs. Trade-offs complicate moral narratives, and moral narratives are her primary currency. Once trade-offs enter the conversation, audiences must confront costs, and costs dilute purity. This does not mean her policy goals are illegitimate or unserious. It means the way they are communicated prioritizes mobilization over feasibility. Mobilization is powerful, but it creates a vulnerability when confronted by adversaries who live inside feasibility. Ted Cruz represents that adversarial style almost perfectly. He does not argue about values first. He argues about records, rules, and contradictions. In many ways, AOC's success trained her to expect a certain type of opposition. She was accustomed to critics who challenged her ideology, not her consistency. Ideological battles can be won rhetorically because they are abstract and values-based. Consistency battles are harder because they are documentary and comparative. You cannot retweet your way out of a spreadsheet. There is also an element of generational contrast that complicates this dynamic. AOC speaks to a generation raised on authenticity culture, where perceived sincerity often outweighs technical mastery. Ted Cruz speaks from a tradition that values procedural dominance and argumentative endurance. When these two frameworks collide, they are not just disagreeing, they are speaking different political languages. That collision is inherently destabilizing, especially when it happens in public. It is worth acknowledging something that is often ignored by both supporters and detractors. AOC's presence forced conversations that would not have happened otherwise. She expanded the Overton window and made certain policy ideas discussable, even if not immediately achievable. That contribution is real, and dismissing it entirely is intellectually lazy. The question is not whether she changed the conversation, but whether she adapted as the conversation changed. As time passed, the expectations placed on her shifted from symbolic to functional. People began asking not just what she stood for, but what she had delivered. This is where media protection started to thin, and scrutiny became more pointed. Not hostile, but inquisitive, which is far more dangerous to a political brand. Inquisitive questions require answers, not applause. This is the context that makes that hearing room moment so revealing. It was not an ambush in the traditional sense, but it was a stress test. Her usual tools, framing, urgency, moral indictment, were deployed exactly as designed. They simply encountered a counter-strategy that did not respond on the same axis. Instead of debating morality, Cruz audited behavior. Audits are deeply uncomfortable because they bypass intention and focus on outcome. They ask not what you meant, but what you did. They do not care how compelling your narrative is, only whether it aligns with the record. For someone whose power is rooted in narrative coherence, that shift is destabilizing. It forces a recalibration that cannot be resolved in real time. There is also a psychological element here that deserves attention. When someone has been affirmed repeatedly for their clarity and courage, they can begin to conflate affirmation with correctness. That does not make them arrogant. It makes them human. But it does make them vulnerable to moments when affirmation suddenly stops. In that vacuum, doubt rushes in. This is why the confrontation mattered beyond the personalities involved. It exposed a fault line between two models of political legitimacy. One model is built on alignment with public emotion, the other on mastery of institutional reality. Both models exist for a reason, and both are necessary in a functioning democracy. The danger arises when one model refuses to acknowledge the limits imposed by the other. As we move forward, it becomes increasingly clear that this was not a simple win or loss. It was a turning point, where insulation gave way to exposure. From that moment on, AOC could no longer rely solely on the assumptions that had protected her early rise. She would now be evaluated not just as a symbol, but as a steward. And stewardship demands a different kind of credibility. In the next section, we are going to shift focus to Ted Cruz and examine why he was uniquely positioned to exploit this moment. We will look at how his background, temperament, and long experience with hostility shaped his response. This is not about glorifying him, but about understanding how certain political personalities thrive under scrutiny. Because the effectiveness of his approach says as much about the system as it does about him. And once you see that clearly, the confrontation begins to look less like a surprise and more like an inevitability. To understand why Ted Cruz was able to reverse the momentum of that moment so decisively, you have to understand how differently he experiences political hostility compared to most of his peers. He has never been insulated by affection, novelty, or cultural alignment, which means he learned early to survive without them. From his earliest days in national politics, Cruz has operated in rooms where the default assumption was skepticism or outright dislike. That environment does not reward charisma, but it brutally rewards preparation and procedural fluency. Over time, that pressure forges a very specific kind of political resilience. Cruz approaches conflict the way litigators approach hostile witnesses, not with emotion, but with anticipation and structure. He assumes the attack will come, not if, but when, and he prepares accordingly. This is not a style designed to win hearts, but to win arguments under scrutiny. Where others memorize talking points, he memorizes timelines, filings, and comparative records. That difference becomes decisive when the conversation shifts from values to verification. One of the most misunderstood aspects of Cruz's political persona is his relationship to attention. He does not require it to function, and in some ways, he actively distrusts it. This makes him appear cold or calculating, but it also frees him from the need to perform consensus. He is comfortable being unpopular if the procedural outcome favors his position. That comfort changes how he handles public confrontation. In the hearing room, this temperament manifested as restraint rather than aggression. While others might have tried to outmatch AOC's moral framing with counter-outrage, Cruz refused to play on that field. He did not deny the emotional resonance of her claims, but he declined to validate their framing. Instead, he repositioned the exchange as an evidentiary review rather than a moral trial. That repositioning forced the audience to adopt a different evaluative lens. This is where Cruz's legal background becomes more than biographical trivia. Legal training conditions individuals to prioritize records over rhetoric and consistency over intent. It teaches you to ask not what someone believes, but what their actions demonstrate over time. When Cruz opened his folder and began referencing documents, he was not improvising. He was executing a prepared strategy. That strategy assumed that moral certainty collapses under sustained factual comparison. There is also a strategic patience at work here that is easy to miss. Cruz allowed the initial attack to fully unfold without interruption. By doing so, he ensured that the narrative commitment was complete and visible. Once someone has fully committed to a narrative publicly, reversing it becomes psychologically and rhetorically difficult. Cruz waited until that commitment was irreversible before responding. This tactic matters because it reveals how differently the two figures view political exchange. For AOC, the exchange was a moment to reinforce identity and values for an audience already inclined to agree. For Cruz, the exchange was an opportunity to alter the evidentiary baseline of the conversation itself. One sought affirmation, the other sought redefinition. Only one of those goals can survive prolonged scrutiny. Cruz's critics often argue that his approach lacks empathy, and in some cases that criticism is fair. However, empathy in politics is not only emotional alignment, it is also intellectual honesty about consequences. By grounding his response in records and timelines, Cruz was implicitly arguing that accountability requires specificity. Specificity narrows the room for moral improvisation. Once narrowed, the conversation becomes less forgiving of narrative shortcuts. There is an irony here that complicates simplistic readings of the exchange. Progressive politics often critiques institutional rigidity, yet relies heavily on institutional assumptions when unchallenged. Cruz exploited that reliance by demonstrating fluency in the very systems often dismissed as illegitimate. He did not attack the institution, he weaponized its transparency. That move forced critics to confront the system on its own terms. It is also important to understand that Cruz's method is not universally effective. It works best in environments where documentation is visible and where time allows for digestion. It does not translate as easily into fast-moving social media cycles without context. That is why this moment did not explode immediately in the way AOC's moments often do. Instead, it lingered, and lingering moments often have longer half-lives. As the exchange continued, Cruz's tone remained notably consistent. He did not escalate emotionally, even as the stakes rose. Consistency of tone reinforces credibility, especially when accusations are serious. It signals confidence in the underlying material rather than dependence on performance. Audiences, even skeptical ones, respond to that signal over time. Another element that strengthened Cruz's position was his willingness to accept imperfection. He did not present himself as morally pure or immune to criticism. Instead, he acknowledged controversy while contextualizing it with verifiable actions. This contrasts sharply with narratives that depend on moral exceptionalism. Once moral exceptionalism is questioned, the fall is often abrupt. Cruz's approach also exploited a subtle but powerful asymmetry in modern politics. Politicians who brand themselves as disruptors are often granted leeway in behavior because they are seen as fighting entrenched systems. Politicians who brand themselves as institutional actors rarely receive that same grace. By forcing AOC into a comparison based on institutional metrics, Cruz reversed that asymmetry. Suddenly, the disruptor was being judged by institutional standards she had not prioritized. This does not mean Cruz emerged as a moral hero in the eyes of all observers. Many viewers remained ideologically opposed to him and skeptical of his broader agenda. But ideological opposition does not negate procedural effectiveness. You can disagree with someone's values and still recognize when they have executed a strategy cleanly. That recognition is what altered the dynamics of subsequent coverage. Media reactions to the exchange reflected this discomfort. Commentators struggled to frame the moment within familiar narratives of outrage and resistance. The lack of explosive rhetoric made it harder to simplify the outcome. Some attempted to reframe it as a distraction or deflection, but the documentation resisted dismissal. Facts have a way of slowing down spin. Within political circles, the reaction was more pragmatic. Staffers and operatives recognized the technique immediately. They understood that this was not about personality, but about method. Quietly, preparation standards began to rise. No one wanted to be the next person caught unready in a documented confrontation. This is how influence often works in Washington, not through speeches, but through behavior change. When a single moment alters how others prepare, it has already succeeded beyond optics. Cruz's method signaled that attacks without corroboration carry increasing risk. It encouraged a recalibration toward defensive readiness. That recalibration does not show up in headlines, but it reshapes outcomes. There is also a deeper psychological effect worth noting. When someone expected to be on offense is suddenly forced into defense, cognitive load increases dramatically. Defensive cognition narrows attention and reduces rhetorical agility. Cruz's documentation-heavy approach exploited this effect mercilessly. It transformed a confident performance into a reactive posture. At this point in the story, it becomes clear that the confrontation was not accidental. It was the intersection of two political arcs moving yet in opposite directions. AOC was transitioning from insurgent symbol to institutional actor, whether she wanted to or not. Cruz had long been an institutional actor operating under constant ideological hostility. That asymmetry favored the one already adapted to scrutiny. None of this suggests that Cruz's approach represents a healthier politics in the abstract. Procedure without empathy can become sterile and disconnected. But moments of excess narrative power often require procedural correction. That correction rarely feels satisfying, but it often feels clarifying. Clarification, not celebration, was the outcome here. As the dust settled, Cruz did not claim victory publicly. He did not tour the moment or inflate its significance. That restraint reinforced the seriousness of his approach. It suggested that the goal was not humiliation, but recalibration. Recalibration is a quieter form of power. In the next section, we are going to examine how the confrontation itself unfolded at a granular level. We will look at the sequencing of claims, the pacing of responses, and the rhetorical traps embedded on both sides. This is where the exchange becomes a case study rather than a spectacle. Understanding this structure explains why the moment resisted easy categorization. And once you understand that structure, the aftermath begins to make much more sense. What made the confrontation truly volatile was not any single accusation, but the way the exchange began to unfold as a sequence rather than a clash. Each statement did not stand alone, but functioned as a setup for what followed, tightening the room with every transition. This was no longer about a punchline or a viral clip. It was about pacing, accumulation, and pressure. When one side relies on moral momentum and the other relies on procedural gravity, time becomes the deciding factor. And time, in that hearing room, tilted unmistakably in one direction. The first trap was subtle and therefore effective, because it did not feel like a trap at all. A broad moral accusation invites an emotional defense, which is easy to dismiss as evasive. But a broad accusation that is met with silence invites curiosity, and curiosity destabilizes certainty. As Cruz allowed the charge to hang without rebuttal, the audience leaned forward rather than recoiling. That shift from outrage to attention changed how everything that followed would be processed. When the response finally came, it did not arrive as a counterattack, but as a reframing. The language moved from what should be to what is, from what feels wrong to what can be verified. This reframing is devastating to narratives built on urgency because urgency depends on forward motion. Verification pulls the conversation backward into records, dates, and comparisons. Once pulled backward, emotional acceleration loses traction. This is where the questions became dangerous, not because they were hostile, but because they were narrow. Narrow questions do not allow rhetorical escape. They demand either specificity or silence. Each question forced a choice between conceding complexity or maintaining simplicity at the cost of credibility. Neither option is comfortable for someone whose power is built on clarity. The audience sensed that discomfort immediately, even if they could not articulate why. There was a moment, almost imperceptible, when the exchange stopped feeling like a debate and started feeling like a review. Reviews are colder than debates and far less forgiving. They care less about intent and more about alignment between words and actions. At that point, humor entered the room not as levity, but as contrast. A wry observation here, a dry comparison there, enough to signal confidence without cruelty. The humor mattered precisely because it was restrained. It did not seek laughter. It sought recognition. Recognition is more powerful than laughter because it invites agreement rather than release. When people nod instead of laugh, they are processing rather than reacting. That processing is where opinions quietly shift. AOC attempted to redirect the conversation back toward values, invoking larger injustices and systemic failures. That move would have worked in almost any other setting, because it aligns with her core strength. But in that moment, it felt like an attempt to widen a narrowing frame. Widening a frame after it has been narrowed reads as avoidance, even when it is sincere. The audience's perception began to change, not of her values, but of her control over the exchange. This is where the confrontation exposed a deeper vulnerability inherent in performance-based politics. Performance assumes a predictable rhythm, where applause follows assertion and critique follows provocation. When the rhythm breaks, the performer must improvise. Improvisation under scrutiny is far more difficult than under affirmation. The room could feel that strain building with each unanswered question. At several points, the exchange flirted with open mockery, but never crossed into cruelty. The tone remained controlled, almost academic, which made the contrast sharper. A cutting observation delivered calmly lands harder than a shouted insult ever could. It signals that the speaker does not need emotional reinforcement to stand behind the claim. That signal resonates strongly with audiences fatigued by constant outrage. One of the most telling moments came when an attempt at moral reversal fell flat. Reversals require symmetry, and symmetry was no longer available. The evidentiary imbalance had grown too large for rhetorical mirroring to feel credible. This is the danger of escalation without exit, because once you raise the stakes, retreat becomes conspicuous. The audience senses retreat even when it is framed as redirection. There was also a subtle shift in body language that reinforced the verbal dynamics. Confidence is not only spoken, it is embodied in pacing, posture, and restraint. As the exchange progressed, those physical cues began to diverge. One side appeared increasingly reactive, the other increasingly settled. Viewers read those cues instinctively, often before they process content. The confrontation did not end with a knockout moment, and that disappointed some viewers expecting spectacle. Instead, it ended with a lingering sense of imbalance that refused to resolve cleanly. Lingering imbalance is far more damaging to a political brand than outright defeat. Defeat can be explained away. Imbalance invites ongoing doubt. Doubt is corrosive because it spreads quietly. What followed in the room was not applause, but a kind of suspended silence. Silence in political spaces is rarely neutral. It usually signals recalibration. People were not deciding who they agreed with, they were deciding what they expected next. Expectations had shifted from inspiration to accountability. Once that shift occurs, returning to pure performance becomes much harder. This is also where the audience's role becomes impossible to ignore. Viewers are not passive recipients of political theater, they are participants in its incentives. By rewarding moments of outrage over moments of explanation, they shape what politicians deliver. But moments like this disrupt that feedback loop by making explanation unavoidable. The discomfort many viewers felt was not partisan, it was cognitive. At several points, the exchange invited a question that hung unspoken in the room. If moral clarity is your brand, how do you respond when the moral spotlight turns inward? If disruption is your identity, how do you operate once you are embedded in the system you critique? These questions are not accusations, they are thresholds. Crossing them requires evolution, not deflection. The confrontation forced a choice between doubling down and adapting. Doubling down preserves identity, but increases vulnerability. Adapting reduces vulnerability, but risks alienating a base accustomed to certainty. There is no painless path through that decision. Every political movement eventually confronts this crossroads. By the time the exchange drew to a close, it was clear that something irreversible had occurred. The rules of engagement had changed, not by decree, but by demonstration. Future confrontations would now carry the memory of this one. Memory in politics is a form of pressure that does not announce itself. It simply waits. In the next section, we will examine how the aftermath of this confrontation began to ripple outward. We will look at media recalibration, shifting alliances, and the quiet behavioral changes that followed. This is where the real consequences of the moment begin to emerge. Not in sound bites, but in incentives. And incentives, more than rhetoric, determine what happens next. The immediate aftermath did not arrive as a tidal wave of declarations, but as a quiet recalibration that could be felt more than heard. Producers stopped chasing the loudest clip and began requesting longer segments, slower explanations, and documents that could survive scrutiny beyond a headline cycle. Editors adjusted keyruns, replacing celebratory verbs with neutral descriptors that signaled caution rather than endorsement. Commentators who once spoke with certainty began hedging, not because their beliefs had vanished, but because confidence had become risky. Risk aversion, in media terms, is often the first sign that a narrative has lost its automatic protection. Social platforms reacted differently, revealing a fracture between speed and endurance. Short clips continued to circulate, but engagement patterns shifted from applause toward interrogation in comment threads and quote posts. Users began asking follow-up questions that required links, timelines, and receipts rather than slogans. Influencers who specialized in instant reaction found themselves overshadowed by accounts that posted annotated breakdowns hours later. Attention started migrating from velocity to verification, a rare but telling change. Inside political offices, the change was even more pronounced because it was procedural rather than performative. Staffers reviewed old statements with fresh anxiety, not to retract them, but to prepare for the possibility of being asked to defend them line by line. Scheduling priorities shifted away from splashy appearances toward meetings that produced paper trails. Legal teams were looped into communication strategy earlier than usual, signaling an expectation of adversarial questioning. When preparation replaces improvisation, it suggests that leadership anticipates resistance rather than applause. Allies began speaking in a new dialect, one that sounded supportive but conditional. Phrases like bold vision and moral urgency were paired with qualifiers such as fiscally responsible and implementation-focused. This linguistic hedging was not accidental. It was an attempt to preserve coalition unity without inheriting liability. Coalitions survive by absorbing shock, not denying it, and this shock had weight. The result was a subtle distancing that looked like moderation without explicitly naming it. Opponents, meanwhile, learned a different lesson that altered their own behavior. They stopped trying to outshout and started trying to outlast, understanding that patience had proven more effective than provocation. Preparation replaced theatrics, and evidence replaced insult as the preferred weapon. This shift did not make politics kinder, but it made it colder and more methodical. Cold politics rarely produces viral heroes, but it often produces durable outcomes. The public response fractured along expectations rather than ideology. Some viewers felt cheated, expecting a definitive winner and receiving instead an unresolved discomfort. Others felt validated, seeing in the discomfort a reflection of their own unease with simplified narratives. This split revealed a growing divide between audiences who want affirmation and those who want answers. Platforms that cater to the latter tend to grow more slowly, but retain trust longer. Humor returned in the days that followed, but it arrived sharpened and specific. Memes no longer relied on caricature alone. They referenced timestamps, documents, and side-by-side comparisons. Satire became educational almost by accident, teaching audiences how to read between claims. This form of humor is harder to dismiss because it carries information within the joke. When laughter teaches, it lingers. There was also a noticeable rise in uncomfortable questions that refused to go away. If performance brought influence, what happens when influence demands accountability? If disruption becomes institution, does it still disrupt, or does it merely brand dissent? If a movement thrives on moral certainty, how does it respond when certainty is challenged by complexity? These questions are not partisan traps. They are structural tests. Internal polling reflected the same ambivalence, showing volatility rather than collapse. Support remained strong among core believers, but softness appeared at the edges where persuasion matters most. Undecided voters cited credibility and follow-through rather than ideology as their primary concerns. This is the demographic that elections turn on, and it is notoriously sensitive to inconsistency. Once inconsistency enters the frame, recovery requires sustained proof rather than rebuttal. Behind the scenes, donors adjusted their calculus with similar caution. Some paused contributions pending clarity, while others redirected funds toward policy development rather than messaging. Money follows confidence, but it also follows risk management, and risk had increased. This did not signal abandonment, but it did signal expectation. Expectation is heavier than loyalty because it demands results. Legislative behavior reflected the new environment in quieter ways. Attendance improved, co-sponsorships diversified, and floor statements became more measured. These changes rarely trend, but they indicate awareness that scrutiny has intensified. When members anticipate being cross-examined beyond their base, they adapt. Adaptation is often invisible until it accumulates. Critically, the confrontation reframed what credibility looks like in contemporary politics. It suggested that sincerity without specificity is vulnerable, and specificity without empathy is brittle. The most resilient posture appears to be a balance that few are comfortable sustaining. That discomfort explains why so many responses sounded rehearsed but cautious. Caution is the tax paid after surprise. The broader culture absorbed the lesson unevenly, but it absorbed it nonetheless. Classrooms, civic groups, and professional associations began using the exchange as a case study, not to pick sides, but to examine methods, assumptions, and consequences. When politics becomes a teaching tool, it has already shifted phases. It moves from spectacle to reference. As days turned into weeks, the absence of a decisive ending became the story. No apology arrived, but no triumph was declared either. This ambiguity frustrated those who crave closure and empowered those who thrive on inquiry. Inquiry is slower, less satisfying, and harder to monetize. But it is also harder to manipulate. What lingered most was a recalibrated sense of risk attached to visibility. Visibility without preparation now looked dangerous rather than empowering. Preparation without visibility looked boring but safe. The incentive structure had tilted, not overturned, but enough to be noticed. Notice is often the precondition for change. In the next section, the focus will turn to long-term implications rather than immediate reactions. We will explore how this moment reshaped strategy, identity, and expectation on both sides. The question is no longer who won the exchange. The question is who learned from it. And learning, in politics, is the rarest victory of all. Time did what arguments could not, because time exposes patterns that moments try to hide. As weeks turned into months, the hearing stopped being referenced as an incident and started being treated as a precedent. Precedents quietly shape behavior without demanding acknowledgement, which is why they are so powerful. No press release announced the change, yet everyone inside the system could feel it. The atmosphere had shifted from theatrical confrontation to anticipatory caution. For Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the challenge was not reputational collapse, but strategic recalibration. Her influence remained significant, her platform intact, her base loyal, but the margins began to matter more than the core. The language softened, the framing widened, and the certainty narrowed into something closer to defensiveness. She still spoke about justice and reform, but with more qualifiers, more references to process and feasibility. That shift did not betray her ideology, but it acknowledged its exposure. For Ted Cruz, the outcome was not universal admiration, but strategic validation. He did not gain new supporters by changing minds as much as by changing expectations. Opponents no longer assumed they could attack without consequence, and allies adjusted their own tactics accordingly. The perception of preparedness became his strongest asset, more influential than any single policy stance. Preparedness, once demonstrated, becomes a deterrent. What this moment revealed most clearly was the fragility of politics built primarily on narrative velocity. Velocity rewards simplicity, immediacy, and moral clarity, but it struggles under sustained examination. Examination demands patience, documentation, and tolerance for complexity. When velocity collides with examination, the faster force often breaks first. That collision defined the exchange more than any individual claim. The audience, often underestimated, absorbed this lesson unevenly but unmistakably. Some viewers disengaged, frustrated by the absence of a clean moral resolution. Others leaned in, appreciating the discomfort as a sign of seriousness rather than failure. Discomfort, after all, is often the byproduct of learning rather than confusion. Those viewers began demanding more from every political figure they watched. This demand altered incentives in subtle but lasting ways. Politicians became more cautious about launching personal attacks without exhaustive preparation. Staffers insisted on internal audits of public statements, travel, disclosures, and attendance records. The era of consequence-free performance narrowed. replaced by a quieter anxiety about verification. Verification became the new currency of credibility. Humor, too, evolved in the aftermath, becoming sharper and less forgiving. Jokes landed only when they aligned with facts, and irony carried more weight than exaggeration. Satire that once relied on caricature now depended on documentation. The funniest lines were the ones that required context to understand. Context, once ignored, had become indispensable. The most profound impact, however, was philosophical rather than tactical. The exchange forced a reconsideration of what leadership actually requires in a media-saturated democracy. Is leadership about articulating moral urgency or about navigating institutional reality? Is it about inspiring belief or about delivering outcomes that survive scrutiny? These questions do not have simple answers, which is why they matter. Both figures emerged changed, whether they acknowledged it publicly or not. One confronted the limits of performance without preparation. The other demonstrated the limits of preparation without persuasion. Neither emerged flawless, but both exposed something essential about modern power. Power today is less about dominance and more about endurance. Endurance favors those who can withstand repeated questioning without collapsing into defensiveness or contempt. It favors those willing to accept complexity without surrendering conviction. It punishes those who mistake affirmation for immunity. And it eventually reveals whether rhetoric and reality can coexist sustainably. That revelation is slow, but it is relentless. As the political cycle moved on, the hearing faded from headlines, but not from memory. It became a reference point, invoked quietly in meetings and strategy sessions. A reminder that cameras record not only words, but preparedness. A reminder that confidence invites challenge. And a reminder that someone, somewhere, is always taking notes. In the end, the story was never about who embarrassed whom in a committee room. It was about the cost of mistaking attention for authority. It was about the danger of believing your own applause. It was about the difference between being right in theory and being ready in practice. And it was about what happens when those differences are exposed in public. Politics did not become more honest overnight, nor did it become less combative. But it did become more careful, and care is often the first step toward accountability. Accountability does not guarantee virtue, but it discourages recklessness. Recklessness thrives in environments without memory. This environment had learned to remember. For viewers, the lesson lingered long after the clips stopped circulating. Not every powerful speech withstands examination. Not every confident leader survives documentation. And not every dramatic moment deserves applause. Sometimes, the most important moments are the ones that make everyone uneasy. Unease signals that something real has occurred, that assumptions have been challenged rather than confirmed, that narratives have been interrupted rather than reinforced, and that the audience has been invited to think rather than react. In an age built on reaction, that invitation is radical. So the final question is not, who won that exchange? Because that answer depends on what one values. The real question is whether politics learned from it, whether future leaders will prepare as carefully as they perform, whether audiences will demand substance as eagerly as spectacle, and whether accountability can outpace applause. Those questions remain unanswered, which is exactly why they matter.